Let's dive in with the class changes first, starting with a Barbarian. They're now going to have a flat 10% damage reduction passively for the Barbarian class, and some skill tree passives have had their damage reduction effects reduced to compensate for this increased damage reduction. Now this just means that Barbarians are going to be more tanky earlier on, and then maybe now you're going to skip those damage mitigation passives later because they're kind of nerfed and just opt to get more damage instead of getting those passives. So this is going to switch things up a little bit. Definitely Barbarians are going to be much more tanky with that 10% passive always on. Also, the Whirlwind Skill will now deal more damage and will now consume more fury. This is pretty crazy because Whirlwind was pretty strong with the right legendaries already. I think it has a lot of potential now to be one of the best builds for Barbarians later on. We're going to have to see exactly how much more damage it does, though, in order to determine that ultimately. Another update, the Double Swing Skill enhancement refunds its full fury cost when used on stunned or knockdown enemies. Now this is a huge buff because previously it refunded 15 fury, but now getting the full cost of 25 fury back means you can double swing infinitely on stunned or knockdown enemies. I think this has a lot of potential for creating a build around knocking down enemies and then using double swing on them over and over, but we're gonna have to see ultimately how it turns out. Moving on to the Druid, companion skills will now deal heavily increased damage. Now this is great. I felt summons were way too weak. I'm hoping it's enough of a buff to make companions viable, which maybe it will be considering all the skills there are, legendary affixes and so on that are meant for summons, but I also hope that the targeting AI gets a little better too. I've found that summons kind of just wander around. It'd be nice if they stick to enemies a little bit better. Also, all ultimate skills have had their cooldowns reduced. This is a welcome buff for sure. I always felt like a lot of the ultimates were a little bit weaker, so it's good to be able to use them more often. And then it says here, usability improvements have been made to maul and pulverize. Now, I'm curious what this means, but it sounds to me like Werebear just got buffed. Don't know what usability improvements means. Maybe it just means they're more usable. I don't know. All right. Also, this is the big one here. Using a non-shapeshifting skill will transform a druid back into their human form. This is actually some of the biggest news for the druid because of how quick shift works. Being able to switch forms when you use a non-shapeshifting skill may have just made hybrid builds viable thanks to the 15% damage bonus when you change forms. That means a 15% damage bonus to Hurricane if you cast it when you're a werewolf or werebear, for example. This is a very exciting change and definitely very excited to play the druid because of this change. Okay, moving on to the Necro. Summoned minions will die more often, requiring players to utilize corpses more often. This is a great change. The minions are definitely nearly invulnerable already, and making them die from either a limited duration or making them less tanky will make summoning them a more active spell, which is really much more fun than just summoning them once and then forgetting about the ability, right? Also, many bonuses in the Book of the Dead have had their stats increased. I think this is great and very much needed. Endgame, everyone just sacrificed their minions, so hopefully this makes them a much better endgame option. I think it will, ultimately. Another change is the damage dealt by Corpse Explosion has been reduced. I think it's a great change because Corpse Explosion is literally free to cast besides consuming a corpse, and it did a lot of AoE damage, so I definitely think that skill needed to be nerfed or changed in some way, so I think this is a great change. The brightness of Skeletal Warriors and Mages has been reduced. Devs said they'd do this. I think it's awesome. Can't wait to see how they look. Hopefully it's a better look. Moving on to Rogues, upgrades for Subterfuge skills have had their bonuses increased. I think this is awesome. I think it's going to help Rogue feel more tanky because it was definitely a pretty squishy class in the beta. Subterfuge skills include Concealment, Smoke Grenade, Poison Trap, and Dark Shroud. Dark Shroud was already pretty strong in my opinion, so I'm very interested to see where it stands after this buff because that's the one I usually go for. Multiple passive skills have had their bonuses increased. I think this is a good change because many rogue passives weren't really that appealing, so hopefully, you know, instead of a 4% close damage reduction, it's a little more or applies to range damage as well. Interested to see what those bonuses are. And then we have a nerf here. All imbuement skills have had their cooldowns increased. This is a pretty big nerf. Shadow Imbue, in my opinion, is what makes the rogue so powerful, so I hope the cooldown wasn't increased too much, but maybe it's a fair balance change. We'll have to see, because I mean, once I use Shadow Imbuement, everything just dies instantly because it's just like a chain reaction action explosion, right? So we'll have to see. Maybe it's just too strong. Maybe they could just make it less strong, but keep the cooldown low, because I really like Shadow Imbuement personally. It's a very fun ability, but ultimately we're just gonna have to see how it feels afterwards. For the Sorceress, Charged Bolt damage was increased and the mana cost to cast has decreased. I think it's a good buff, but I think really the erratic nature of the spell is why other spells are chosen. We'll see if the buff is strong enough to warrant choosing this spell over Chain Lightning. And speaking of Chain Lightning, a change which decreases the damage of Chain Lightning and reduces its effectiveness against bosses was also in these notes. I'm curious to see how big of a decrease in damage this is, but definitely makes sense considering how strong it is. Also, the Sorceress received this change which will decrease the cooldown for Incinerate's skills enchantment bonus. So Incinerate's enchantment bonus is that every 20 seconds a serpent spawns and incinerates enemies for 6 seconds. So it sounds like it'll happen more frequently now. I'm wondering how many seconds they took off, but it's going to happen more frequently. Firewalls will now spawn underneath enemies more frequently when using its enchantment bonus. So Firewall's enchantment was that each time an enemy takes burning damage, there's a 5% chance to spawn 2 firewalls underneath them for 3 seconds. So it sounds to me like this change is going to make that 5% a little bit higher, so it procs more often. I think this can be a powerful buff for the Fire Sorc, which I think is already going to be probably one of the main builds in the endgame. Also, Sorceress got another buff which increases the lucky hit chance for the Meteor Skills enchantment bonus. Meteor Skill enchantment is lucky hit, 3% chance for a meteor to fall on enemies. Sounds like a good call to increase it. Honestly, out of all the class-specific features, I felt Sorcerers had the weakest one, so I like these 3 changes all very much. I think they're really paying attention to Sorceress, and I think these are good changes. Now, there are also general balance changes, so effects like Stun and Freeze applied to elite monsters can be applied to elite monsters twice as long before they become unstoppable, so this makes elites more CCable. I think it's a good buff. I mean, elites were decently strong in Diablo IV. They've also reviewed class skills to confirm that all classes have access to sufficient skills that remove control impairing effects. I mean, I can review it for you and I can confirm for you every class does in fact have at least one skill that removes crowd control, but I'm glad the developers went and did that. I mean, I think Barbarian has 2. I mean, every class has enough, but you know, I think it's a good call out that everyone should use one. Another update is that many legendary powers have had updates to their effectiveness. Now, very vague saying updates sounds like it could be a buff or a nerf. We'll have to see what they've changed ultimately. Hopefully they're all buffs because legendary powers are fun, but we're gonna have to see. Very vague, very vague update there. And when it comes to encounters, Blizzard also made a bunch of changes. The Butcher has been reevaluated for difficulty and will present a greater challenge in World Tiers 3 and 4. Now that's awesome, and considering how many players were butchered by the Butcher, I'm glad to see that added difficulty because it was already pretty tough, right? Now imagine them in World Tier 3 and 4. I imagine the Butcher is going to be a terrifying sight in the future. Bosses such as Tachort, Melnock, Venard, and others were reevaluated for melee character difficulty, resulting in changes to attacks and fight mechanics. Lots of the feedback was that bosses are melee unfriendly. It sounds like maybe they won't be as much so in the final release. Moving on to Cellars, they've increased the chance for a dungeon event to occur in Cellars. That's great. Very good change. Many players didn't even know why Cellars existed. Cellars will now consistently reward a chest upon completion. There you go, another incentive. Also, they fixed an issue where the guaranteed elite monster would be absent from a cellar. So literally Cellars are supposed to guarantee an elite monster and a chest. So now those things are actually going to be there. So that's great. That's what the point of a cellar is, to get those guaranteed things. Another really big change is that the reset dungeon button is gone. It's been disabled. I think this is pretty huge, and it stops players from farming the first few parts of dungeons and then resetting. I'm curious how dungeons will be reset now. Maybe you can redo a dungeon once you've cleared the whole dungeon. Not sure, but I really liked that button. So it's gone, and I'm interested to see what's going to replace it for getting those dungeons reset. Speaking of dungeons, there have been some massive changes announced to dungeons. One of the most common pieces of feedback that Blizzard received was that players felt they were doing a lot of backtracking within certain dungeons, and they've optimized multiple dungeons across all zones to minimize the need for backtracking. They've actually listed dungeons specifically here within Fractured Peaks, which received layout updates. I'm just going to post it on the screen there. I'm not going to read through them. Now, Blizzard says that their primary goal with the layout changes was to reduce certain kinds of backtracking, which detract from a player's experience. An example of this change is that players previously needed to enter side rooms to interact with structure objectives, causing them to retread the same same path. Now, many of our structure objectives have been repositioned along main dungeon pathways, making them easier for players to reach and allowing them to readily explore the dungeon after defeating the structure. I think it's a great change. It's definitely boring to just watch your character run for 20 to 30 seconds just in order to keep progressing. Now, definitely these structure objectives, I do remember they're a little bit out of the way, and you kind of had to go find them. Pretty good that you basically are going to run into them inevitably, so I like it. Also, Blizzard has increased the chance for an event to spawn inside of a dungeon from 10% to 60%. I think that's an awesome change. That means most dungeons you do are going to have an event within them. It's going to keep dungeons exciting and interesting. And then also, to reduce the need to backtrack, small numbers of straggling monsters will seek out the player to help complete the kill all monsters objective. This is such a great change. These kill all monster objectives can be such a pain to find that one monster left, and having them seek you out too is such a great idea. I mean, this is something they should go and add to like Diablo 2 Den of Evil. I mean, like it happens every time where you're like, all right, where's that last guy I missed, you know, especially in a non-linear dungeon where there's like multiple paths you can go down, right? So very great change. There's also a bunch more changes happening to dungeons. Specifically, when Animus is gathered, the player will gain 10 resource, reduce all active cooldowns by 1 second. And then when you deposit Animus, there was a channel time to deposit it. That's now instant. Whenever you rescue someone in a dungeon, that's been cut in half. So you usually have to channel rescuing someone. That's 1.5 seconds now. All rescue objectives now drop a health potion upon completion. If you need health potions, that's nice. It's going to help you, maybe in World Tier 3, you might need that more so. Whenever you carry a objective, so Ancient Statue, Bloodstone, Mechanical Box, Stone Carving, right? You're going to get a momentum bonus granting 25% move speed so that whenever you're carrying that, you can more quickly get back to wherever you have to drop that off, which again, it's backtracking. So they're trying to give you that move speed to make the backtracking less of a time consuming thing, right? Also, whenever you use a pedestal, channel time's been reduced to be instant. And then whenever you return a portable object to its pedestal, it's also going to now restore all of your health, resources, all your potions, and reset all your cooldowns. This typically happens near the end of a dungeon right before a boss. So that's probably why they do that. Usually there's a healing well right before a boss. So now it's basically just like, there you go. You get everything back, including your cooldowns. Now, all doors within dungeons are going to generate a minimap ping when they're opened. I think that's good. It was kind of hard to know that after you completed that objective, you can now progress. So now you're going to get a little minimap ping to know they're opened up. Very good change. And then all structure objectives in dungeons now have additional combat mechanics player must overcome. I think that's great because I'm like wailing on this like structure objective, not knowing like is something supposed to happen. Like I always felt like, creatures would spawn to defend it, but they were largely ignorable, right? Like you just keep wailing on the structure till it's gone. So I'm excited to see what these additional combat mechanics are. Hopefully they become a little more engaging because I felt they just kind of fell over. It was kind of too easy. Didn't really understand it very much, but good change. We'll have to see though exactly what it is. Okay, UI improvements. Chat will now display on the left side of the screen when using the centered action bar configuration. Thank you. This is such a great change. The chat on the right was driving me insane. In all Blizzard games, I swear it's on the left. I don't know why it was on the right during the beta. Great change that it's where it should be now. Also, a character's stats will be displayed by default when players click the materials and stats button within their inventory. Should definitely be that way. Good change. The move and interact inputs can now be mapped to one button while the primary attack input is mapped to a secondary button. This is a great change for a lot of players. A lot of players wanted that flexibility with mapping so they can make their left mouse button be interact and move, and they wanted it to be split from the primary attack so that you can interact with a different button, attack with a different button. So, for a lot of players, it's annoying that left click is both. Glad that they have that functionality and the flexibility to do your mappings that way. And here's a big one for a lot of players. The sans serif font used in game has been replaced with a new serif font. The font has changed. I got to see what the new one is though before I celebrate. To be honest, the font wasn't great, but what if this next one's worse? We don't even know. So we'll have to keep an eye on that one. Now, if you've learned something new or are enjoying the video so far, leave a like down below as it really helps me out on YouTube. Thank you. And while you're down there, consider subscribing if you're new here. I've got lots of Diablo 4 videos just like this coming your way as fast as I can make them, and it would be great to have you along for the ride. Now, on April 14th in an Xbox podcast, Rod Ferguson said that every time you change a zone in Diablo 4, you switch servers, but to the player, it's seamless. Now, this sounds a lot like layering, and every time you change a zone, you change layers. Like if there's an event at the edge of a zone, I'm kind of afraid players might take advantage of knowing that you change zones, right? right? And just reset the event over and over to farm it, right? Like you complete the event, change zones, go back, do it again because you're changing servers, right? But we're gonna have to see how this open world server changing works out. I imagine there's lots of opportunities for exploitation. Like even in World of Warcraft, you'd like mine a node, ask someone to invite you from a different layer, and then that node would be there in the other layer, right? So you just double dipped on that same node. And so that still exists in WoW. This, I'm wondering, will probably exist in Diablo 4, right? Like you join someone's group, you probably go to their zone, their server, their layer, whatever you want to call it. We'll have to see how this works out though ultimately. Glyphs for Paragon boards are found in the open world. I actually thought they were only in Nightmare Dungeons, so this is new to me. And it's going to give buffs to nodes around them on the Paragon board. So the idea is that you get these glyphs and that's going to buff all the nodes. I think it's a really, really cool new functionality. And then what's even more interesting is that a developer said that you will move your Paragon points around as you take on harder and harder challenges and presumably as the meta changes. I thought this was very interesting because this means that the Paragon board is going to be very fluid, something you change around a lot depending on the season perhaps, or as balance changes are made and the meta changes, you kind of learn what the best build is. I think that it's kind of interesting. The Paragon board is starting to feel like, just something that you reallocate your points a lot to depending on the challenge. So I thought the Paragon board was sort of like set it and forget it. Sounds like it's going to be one of the main ways to continue to customize your character over time. Moving on, season journeys from Diablo 3 are coming back in Diablo 4, and it comes with XP boosts as you progress, which sounds enticing. I really enjoyed the season journeys, and it would be nice to get some bonus XP as you progress through it. Developers continue by saying you're looking at roughly 80 hours worth of time invested to complete the entirety of the battle pass. To level a character to level 100 could take a little longer than that based on how you play. Now, that means it will take longer than 80 hours to hit max level, and that's around how long it will take to complete the battle pass. So if you play 4 hours a day, that means it will take 20 days to give you an idea of how long it takes just to complete all the seasonal content. Also, important to note that you can finish the season journey and the battle pass without ever hitting max level. This is different from Diablo 3, where hitting max level was actually a requirement to complete the season journey. So being able to enjoy the new content each season will not require hitting max level, which would take more than 80 hours. So it's kind of more appealing to a more casual player base, allowing them to do everything new with the season without having to hit max level. Developers continued by saying it's going to take 25 to 30 hours to level from level 1 to 50. And in Diablo 4, once you hit level 50, that's when the end game content actually begins from World Tier 3, which is Nightmare. End game content beginning before you're even max level. I think that's a cool, innovative thing going on with Diablo 4. Typically, you reach the end game once you're max level and then some, right? So very cool. Also, they noted that seasonal content will rotate out so that it doesn't get overwhelming having to learn about every single thing that gets added each season, but instead just one season worth of new things to avoid making the game too complicated over time. This is a huge announcement. Now, if you've played Path of Exile, you know that they add, new stuff each league. And, honestly, like if you come back to the game after having missed a few, like there's just so many new things added, it can actually get kind of overwhelming. And so I think this is a great change to keep the game simple. As they add new stuff each season, it's going to rotate out and the new stuff's going to come in. So, maybe you missed something, but at least it won't all just build up. And then there's just all these systems that have been added for each season, all these quests, and it's just too overwhelming, right? I think this is a really awesome thing that they're planning to do here. So moving on to talking a little bit more about PvP, we learned that items are actually going to change depending on if you're playing PvE or PvP. So when you enter into a world PvP zone, they've decided some items are just going to be too good for PvP, so they actually get adjusted. Now, we don't know exactly in what way, but makes total sense that some are just going to be completely overpowered and will need to be adjusted so that it's somewhat balanced in PvP. Developers have also said that players can max the Paragon board, but it's an extremely long cycle to go through all of that, and it's not something you'd accomplish in a single season, which is again about 3 months. Developers said they thought about things in Paragon before, and one of the tenets they actually had for themselves was trying to cap progression as opposed to having unlimited progression within a season or just in general. So expect to not reach level 100 each season, basically is what they're trying to say, which again is kind of new and interesting that you won't even reach max level by the time a season ends. I'm sure some people will be able to, but sounds like the majority will not. Developers have also said they wanted to avoid one-shotting in PvP, and there are currently no no plans for specific items or attributes for PvP. So like in WoW, resilience for PvP, right? That's like a PvP specific attribute. I thought ears would be specifically for PvP, right? Like you kill a player, you get their ear. I think that's probably one exception to the rule, but very, very interesting that not as much focus is going on to PvP. And they continue by saying overall, the PvP content itself may not be perfectly balanced. So there you have it. Some classes will just dominate in PvP and others will struggle. And it sounds like that's just the way it's going to be. And finally, the last piece of news we have is that stat bonuses obtained from the Altar of Lilith will not be included in the season reset. So every season you lose your XP, everything gets lost, items, renown even, but the stats you get from the Altar of Lilith will carry over season to season. Very, very cool. Tons of updates this time, guys. Which one was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't seen my top 10 tips for new players of Diablo 4, click the video shown on the screen right now, and I will see you there in just a second.